What's up, Sonic Academy? Paul here, aka P-LASK, with a brand new Tech Tips video series for you, this time all about synthesis secrets. So we'll be taking a look at a lot of these techniques in Sonic Academy's very own Ana 2 synth, but I'll also be breaking a few of these down in Ableton's wavetable and operator synths as well. And what we're going to be looking at are some of those features that are common to a lot of synthesizers that often go overlooked. These are things like oscillator sync, ring modulation, FM, frequency modulation, legato, portamento, stuff like that. So it's things that maybe you know a little bit about, maybe you've dabbled with them before, but we're really going to break them down and kind of talk about what they're doing to the sound under the hood. So to kick things off, we'll get going with a little breakdown of sound and the fundamentals of sound, and also harmonics and how harmonics work. And then we'll see how a lot of these different features, a lot of these different techniques are going to affect the harmonics in different ways to create new source sounds to start with. So I'm hoping that this gives you some new inspiration for your own sound design process. Let's go ahead and get started. Now, before we start getting really heavy into these synthesis tech tips, I did want to spend some time in this first video just going over the fundamentals of sound. And this is something that's, to my surprise, as I've produced for a number of years and been teaching for a number of years, I've met many other veteran producers who did not know the stuff that we are about to go over in this video. And they're amazing sound designers too, but they didn't know this stuff. So I think it's good to kind of recap the fundamentals of sound, what a sound is made up of. And once we do that, everything we're going to look at in this course is going to make a whole lot more sense, and we're going to be able to see more clearly and hear more clearly what is going on with these different features in our synthesizers. So for this particular video, I'm going to be using Ana 2. I've initialized the patch, which should give us a saw wave sound, but I'm going to change the waveform on oscillator 1 here to a sine. We're going to start with a sine wave. That's got a little bit of a pop at the beginning of the sound. The reason for that is because the amp envelope's attack time is a little too fast, so we're just going to slow that down a bit, maybe like 3 or 4 milliseconds. Should do it for us. There we go. Okay, now I'm also going to use the aid of a few other plugins here. These are actually free plugins from a developer called Melda Production, M-E-L-D-A. If you want to Google search that, you can download these. They're free. This is called the oscilloscope. And this is basically just going to show us, if I play the sine wave, it's going to show us just a readout of what that sine wave looks like. And then the other plugin we're going to be using is called the M Analyzer, also from Melda Production. And this is going to show us basically the harmonic spectrum, or the audible spectrum, I should say. And this is showing us frequencies from 20 hertz, or 20 cycles per second, all the way up to 20,000 hertz, or 20K, it's abbreviated, which is 20,000 cycles per second. So we'll get into what all that means. If you don't understand that terminology, don't worry. But what I want to talk about in this video is how all sounds from your favorite synth patch on your favorite plugin synth to door slamming are made up of these three components. And those three components are volume, pitch, and tone. So let's start with the first one, which is probably the easy one to understand, which is volume. This is also sometimes referred to as amplitude. Volume simply has to do with the loudness of a sound. And if you're looking at an oscilloscope or a readout of a waveform, or even if you're looking at an audio sample that you dragged in, a drum loop or something from your sample collection, the taller the waveform looks, the higher its volume or its amplitude is going to be. And the oscilloscope will actually show us that. So if I open up Ana 2 here and we play this sine wave, let's take a look at our oscilloscope. Play the sine wave, we see we got a little bit of amplitude there. But if I go here to oscillator 1's volume setting and I start to turn that up, let's move this over so we can see both next to each other. We see the amplitude of the waveform increases, we hear it getting louder, and we see that the waveform has gotten taller, right? So volume, pretty easy, how loud or soft a sound is. This has to do with the amplitude of its waveform. Okay, so that's volume. Let's talk about pitch. This one can be a little bit confusing. I mean, I'm sure if you've ever sat in front of a MIDI keyboard or played piano or played any sort of instrument, you kind of understand what pitch is. We have pitches that go from A to G, and we have sharps and flats in between those. But really what those are, those lettered pitches that we use on a keyboard, for example, those are just basically specific frequencies that we've assigned a letter to. And we know that those sound harmonically pleasing to our ears, so we use those frequencies when we're writing music. But there are frequencies that exist all over the place. I mean, really up to infinity. Our ears, however, are only tuned to a certain set of frequencies. We can only hear frequencies that vibrate as slow as 20 hertz and as fast as 20,000 hertz. And if you remember that analyzer plugin, it shows us that audible spectrum, right? So what is hertz? What does this mean? What is a frequency? Well, a frequency is essentially a number of cycles per second, or hertz, I should say, is a measure of cycles per second. And frequency is a measure of, well, how many hertz or how many cycles per second is your waveform oscillating or vibrating at? Because really all sound is it's wiggles in the air. And those wiggles vibrate at a certain speed, and they have a certain amplitude, so there's a certain loudness or softness to them. So again, if we play this sine wave, you can see here that I'm playing a C3 note, and it identifies that on the analyzer here. But we can also see above where it says C3, it says 258.3 hertz. So basically, this C3 is a sine wave that's oscillating or that's vibrating, or if we look at the oscilloscope, it's going through that full cycle 258.3 times every second. And that's what's giving us that frequency. That's what's giving us that pitch, that C. So frequency and pitch are actually two words for the same thing. When we say frequency, we're dealing more with the number of cycles per second. When we say pitch, we're kind of dealing with that letter abbreviation that we use to identify a pitch if we want to play it musically. Now you might be thinking, okay, so this is, if I'm playing musically tuned stuff, that makes sense. But what about, you mentioned door slamming earlier, Paul. And yeah, I did. Thanks for listening. But a sound like that, that's a little bit more abstract. That's not necessarily something that's tuned musically. That also has a specific frequency or a specific pitch, although that frequency/pitch might be sitting somewhere in between where our notes are tuned on the keyboard. So it's not going to sound like, oh, you hear a door slam and you're like, oh, that's a C sharp. It's going to be, a certain number of cycles per second, but it might not be something that can be tuned musically. It might also be several frequencies or several tones that we hear at once when we hear a door slam, for example, or a bus drive by outside, or a bird chirping or whatever. So there's, all sound has these three components. So again, we've talked about volume and we've talked about pitch. Let's talk about tone. So tone essentially is the characteristics of a sound, or how you might describe a sound. So for example, this sine wave, it's kind of like mellow. Some might say it sounds kind of dull. It's not very bright. It's kind of smooth sounding. All of these words are describing the tone of the sound. Now, if we switch waveforms here, and I'm just going to stick with really basic subtractive waveforms, we'll keep the analyzer over here off to the side. But if I switch waveforms from the sine wave to, let's go back to the saw wave, for example, this has quite a different tone to it. And the reason for that is because it has all of these additional frequencies sounding off or playing when I play that. So again, the sine wave is literally just a single frequency. A saw wave is actually many frequencies playing together. And these additional frequencies above, I'm currently playing a C2 note. And let's do this just so we don't have to sit here and wear our ears out listening to that. There's actually a freeze button here. If I can find it, here it is. Okay, so now we can just see the harmonics. That's what these are called. So we have the first harmonic, or the fundamental frequency. That represents the note or the pitch I'm playing on the keyboard. But all of these additional frequencies, these are called harmonics or partials or overtones. Those are what give this sound its unique tone characteristic. Another word for tone, which you may have heard before, is timbre, T-I-M-B-R-E. Both, again, two words for the same thing. But the tone or timbre of a sound is a result of its harmonics. The additional frequencies or overtones that exist above the fundamental, that's what gives it a unique tone. So let's go back to one of our other waveforms. Here's the sine wave again. Sine wave, by the way, the simplest waveform. It's just a single frequency, a single pitch. Let's check out the square wave. Let's go down an octave to C2. And again, if we pause it, we have a slightly different set of harmonics here, giving it a slightly different tone. And that's kind of the thing with sound, is that all these different tones are generated because different sounds have a different series of harmonics that are kind of spaced out above the fundamental frequency, is what we call the first harmonic. So this is how we can tell a piano from a guitar, from a synthesizer, from an oboe, for example. All these different instruments, they could all conceivably play the same pitch and conceivably play at the exact same volume, but we can tell them apart from each other because of their unique characteristic tones that are composed of all the different harmonics that exist in those sounds. So if that starts to make sense to you, let's jump into the next video.
Thanks everyone for watching. We really appreciate the support from you guys. If you liked this video, then smash that like button, and if you want to be notified about new content, hit the subscribe and the bell notifications. Peace!